Thanks so much for inviting me. This is great. I've been to a couple great talks in this venue, so it's fun to actually be able to give one myself. Um, so this is work that I did through the Berkman Klein Center at the law school. I'm a fellow there in addition to I'm a PhD student in computer science here at Harvard, but I'm also a fellow at the law school where I work with Susan Crawford. And so this is a report that we put together with Gabe Cunningham, Ariel Ekblaw, Paul Komeners, and Andrew Linzer. So a good team effort here. And so I'm kind of just going to first talk through, give a quick overview of open data, but I think we'll do that quickly because everyone here is pretty familiar. Then talk about some of the fundamental privacy issues, and then go into the playbook itself and kind of how we put that together and what some of our key case studies and recommendations are. So open data, obviously there's a lot of data that cities collect, and it kind of spans a really broad range of things from transit schedules to crime reports to building permits to employee salaries and taxi trips and locations of schools and parking lots and all of this stuff. And so now there's kind of this move towards opening it up, and there's this really broad and exciting range of data in cities, and which makes it really interesting, and everyone has really different interests. And I think this is both exciting because there's so much different stuff to dive into, but also starts presenting some of these challenges because the types of data are so diverse and have such different elements in them and connect to individuals in very different ways. So it's both an opportunity and a challenge to have all of this really interesting data that people, as becoming more people are, interested in urbanism and really getting engaged with cities. There's a lot of interest in this type of data. So there's a lot of opportunities and challenges here. Kind of skip through, what open data means. I think one interesting thing that comes into play here is public records. I think, sometimes the first response is, well, wait, open data, how does that relate to public records laws? There's already, in ways of getting government data, there's already been a way for getting government data for a long time. And, there are a couple of main ways to differentiate. First of all, public record laws are reactive. You have to go and request to someone for that data. And then the process can be really slow and inefficient to actually get that data. It can be both for you as well for a city government because they have to do kind of a one-off process if you request something to actually release that information. And there are a lot of barriers to entry because you have to know what data you want. You have to be really motivated to ask for it and know ahead of time exactly what you want, which is often really hard. If you're not really, if you don't have a lot of expertise in city government, you may not even know exactly what they have, you may not know what to ask for, or you may not want to go through that type of process. So it's sort of a very limited access sort of thing, whereas open data is much more about being proactive and releasing data proactively for anyone to use and anyone to see, and making it already in a machine readable format, whereas often public records have been, you get a PDF or something like that is often how it's been. So it's not that usable afterwards. Government data, innovation, transparency, accountability, collaboration. There's a lot of reasons. I think you all are pretty familiar with those in terms of what the point of releasing open data is. And I think different cities approach it in slightly different ways. Some are really going for the a lot of people, there's like Sunlight Foundation, people who really are excited about the transparency and accountability aspects, and a lot of other folks who really think about collaboration and civic engagement and new ways of using data as a medium to connect people with the public and to kind of create a new type of engagement that's not just about basic services or voting, but also kind of working on projects together and co-creating or diving into how government works in new ways and kind of getting new ways of thinking about that. So I think there's a lot of different opportunities around open data depending on how the government and the people pursue it. It's pretty flexible in that way, I think. So kind of the open data movement, in 2009, Obama, or in his first day, published a memo about being transparent, participatory, collaborative. Many cities have since followed suit and opened open data programs. This map kind of just shows, I think this is a map not of who has an open data program, but maybe who has an open data policy. But as you can, this is more about the policy side, this particular map, but as you can see, it's really starting to spread across the country, and lots of cities are, opening up new open data portals and starting, from big, now lots of smaller cities and smaller towns across the country, and many around the Boston area. And again, this is really exciting because there's lots of new data and lots of new cities are pursuing this and trying to become more open and work with the public in new ways and pursue all of these different types of potential benefits. But again, it raises new challenges because every city, there's kind of these new questions of privacy and transparency that cities are trying to grapple with. And as each one starts a new open data program, they have to grapple with those questions. And as we're kind of seeing right now a real rise in, we're kind of at that peak point where I think like the rate of new open data programs and new data sets is probably at its highest. And so that's great, but it means there's a lot of people trying to figure out how to do it right. And that's what we're really trying to help them do. Some of the impacts of open data, it ranges from applications around, a transit map to, animations or visualizations of what's gone on in the past. The New York ACLU has used open data and public records requests to actually analyze stop and frisk in New York. So that's a really high impact example of how they use that data to show that it was discriminatory, and also then to track the rise and then the decline after they helped change the policy. So that was a really impactful example of how open data could be used when it falls in, when advocates get their hands on that and can target it in the right ways. But cities have used it to, help people find parks and stuff like that. So there's a lot of, it's kind of a very strong and burgeoning civic tech community around using this stuff. I've heard examples of the city of Boston releases a data set of query vendors. So that's, vendors. And so query is the criminal background check. And so it's a list of vendors that the city or companies in the city of Boston that do not hold a criminal record against someone when they're applying for jobs, and people who work in prisons and prison reentry programs have used that data set to help target people to jobs. And that's something that the city actually just found out about a couple weeks ago when someone kind of mentioned it to us offhand. So that's a great example of how open data can turn into things that you would never even expect necessarily, right? Someone might just put that data set up thinking maybe it's interesting, someone might want to see it. It's interesting from a transparency perspective, but you might not realize that that's getting into the hands of people who are trying to find jobs after coming out of jail. So there's a lot of great impacts, and I think, but there's also a lot of room to improve the impact of open data. There's obviously a lot of hype around it. Was this McKinsey saying it's $3 trillion or $3 billion? I mean, I don't even know where that number comes from, but it's more just to say there's a lot of talk about kind of open data as the great new thing that's going to solve civic engagement and add a ton to the economy. And I think it's important to stay level-headed with any new development like this, and that there are obviously opportunities, some of which I've just mentioned, but there are challenges and there are downsides and risks, and we shouldn't expect it to do something like this. I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had around open data and impact, and actually how to move beyond just releasing data sets into changing lives in the city and actually improving life in the city for a broad range of people. Dan O'Neill, who used to run Smart Chicago, which is kind of an open data, Chicago open data civic tech community, he left about a year ago and talked about how we were working with these technologists and they were doing nice stuff, but we weren't really actually helping the community and building technology that helps the broader non-tech community of Chicago. And that's a pretty big challenge for open data, and something that I've been working with the city of Boston for a while. So not so much central to the playbook, but something that we can definitely talk about more if people are interested in kind of thinking about how open data can be leveraged in the best ways. So now I want to go through some of the fundamental privacy issues at play and why we should be concerned about privacy when we're releasing open data. So there's kind of this traditional concept around data and privacy, which I think the main thing that people think about is personally identifiable information, or PII. And I guess traditionally it's been thought of as, okay, well, PII is your name, your address, your social security number. It's very easy to identify what PII is, right? That's kind of the way that we've often thought about it, as you can say these are the fields that are PII, the rest is not. It's pretty easy to anonymize data just by removing that PII. The sense of metadata, that's, it might be just records about the data or broader information is harmless, and that's not sensitive in any way. And even just some of the privacy laws that exist are more focused around, this general sense that there's a limited sense or a limited capacity to observe any individual in terms of, what happens in the public right-of-way and public space is obviously not private information, but that dynamic sort of changes where, obviously if you're walking down the street, someone can see that, but that changes when suddenly, it's possible to collect everyone walking down the street at all times. Just, we're kind of, that's kind of I think, part of the, one of the assumptions that goes into the privacy laws that we have today, as well as this sense of, terms and conditions that, if you kind of all have agreed to millions of contracts and we sign up for Facebook and iTunes and all of these things and probably don't read them. But again, there's a sense of, well, it's on the consumer or the user to, if they opt in to this service, then they've agreed to whatever we've put in the privacy policy, we can set whatever privacy policy we want. And this is kind of the world that a lot of cities are operating under, or, at least traditionally have been thinking about in terms of privacy and security. But a lot of research in recent years has highlighted some of the limits of de-identification. And by de-identification really means making a data set unidentifiable. So that would be, removing personally identifiable information. So obviously LaTanya's work is really at the foundation of this and was one of the first studies to kind of show that this was not possible. She looked at, there were health records that were released in Massachusetts, and I think the governor, Bill Weld, at the time, he said, oh, this is fine, we've removed name and address, and so this data is not sensitive, it's fine, we can release these records. And about a week later, his own medical records showed up in an envelope to his desk. And what happened was LaTanya had connected that with public information of voter lists, which include clearly identifiable information of names and addresses, but also zip codes and birthdays and information that was also in the medical data that was supposedly anonymous. And by combining these data sets together, she was able to link individuals to many data sets. So that's just one example of limits of de-identification and how multiple data sets, when put together, can be, can yield information that's not possible from any single data set by itself, which is, increasingly important as there's more and more data out there. We have to be conscious not just of what single data set is maybe being released or is being collected, but how that plays with other data sets that are available. Another example is more, this is from maybe 2 or 3 years ago from MIT, and they were looking at metadata patterns and behavioral patterns to see how unique are the traces that you leave behind, kind of a more modern story around the data collection that companies do. So they looked at both cell phone traces as well as credit card traces, saying, so kind of looking at the history of where someone was over time and where they made a purchase. So, the data about an individual might be, you bought, shoes at noon in Harvard Square. 2 hours later, you got a sandwich down the street in Mount Auburn Street. Then that evening, you got dinner in Central Square. You got a drink down the road later, right? So, these traces may seem, I think, traditionally it's been, well, this is just metadata, right? We're not saying what you bought. We're just seeing what the transaction was. And I think what's interesting here is that when I think part of the reason this has traditionally not seemed sensitive is that if you look at it by eye, it can be really hard to figure, to see that there's a sensitivity concern. Because if you were to just read, the table, you wouldn't necessarily be able to pick up a pattern of where people were and what was going on. But the ability now with the computer, I think, even just to make sense of these massive logs of, say, 1 million or 1 billion data sets and parse it in interesting ways is part of what makes this data sensitive. So that what happens is, one record, say at Starbucks at noon, is not particularly sensitive, right? There's probably a lot of people who go into Starbucks in a given hour, right? But the problem is that as you go to more and more places, and as that history of an individual person gets longer and longer, the risks get more and more extreme because there might be 50 people in that Starbucks with you, but how many of those people are at the same sandwich shop 2 hours later? How many of those people are at the same restaurant that evening? And all these things. And once you have, they found that once you have 4 data points about a person's transaction history, just where they were and when, you can identify 90% of people uniquely, which is a pretty shocking number. So it just shows how unique the sort of metadata traces that we leave, how unique they are. So, and with this type of research coming out, computer scientists have kind of come up with, any attribute can be identifying in combination with others. There's no, clear-cut line of information that is sensitive and not sensitive, and it's not just about, the obvious PII anymore. It's about all sorts of other types of data, such as, where you made a credit card transaction or where you got into where you went into a restaurant or got into a taxi and stuff like that. So the notions around privacy from a technical perspective have really shifted over the past maybe 10 or 20 years in terms of thinking about how much data is out there about individuals and how easy it often is to identify someone or learn a lot of information about them from data that would traditionally not be considered as sensitive. So these privacy risks have already come to play in municipal open data. I think this is a really interesting example. So in 2013, all of New York City's taxi trip data was released. And what they had was point-to-point timestamp. So they had a timestamp for when when the taxi trip started and where it was, and then when and where that taxi trip ended. And again, this is kind of like the metadata example. It seems not particularly sensitive at first glance. You have, maybe millions or whatever number of pickups and drop-offs, and you can, it's like, well, it's just a lot of pickups and drop-offs, and we don't really know what's going on there. But it's pretty easy once you start diving into it to pick up pretty personal patterns. So in one case, what someone did was they combined it with other data sets that were available, in this case, paparazzi photos of celebrities getting into New York, because there's a lot of those in New York, and TMZ and all sorts of places are doing that. So it's not that difficult to find a picture of, say, Bradley Cooper getting into a taxi. And because that image, exactly when and where he got into that cab, you can find the exact pickup in the data set, and you can see where he went and how much he paid, and identify particular patterns. So this shows if you were to know where anyone pretty much got into a cab, if you were with someone when they got into a cab or saw someone get into a cab, you could probably figure out from this data set where they went. And there's this one piece of auxiliary information allows you to trace their path through the city. There's an interesting other thing that went on here, which was that the data set included not just the fare, but the tip. And for a lot of these celebrities that the data scientists looked at, it showed that they had not paid a tip, which then led to a bit of a controversy back and forth of whether they were cheap or whether it didn't show up in data or what was going on. My sense is that a lot of the tips just didn't show up in the data, especially if they're cash tips, or most of the trips didn't actually have a tip attached to it. But this highlights not just the ability with accurate information to trace individuals, but what happens when there's information about individuals out there and some of that information is wrong or it's inaccurate or it's missing, and suddenly you get inferences about a person that may or may not be true, and it's disputed. Did you have a?
Yeah, so we actually had a student work with this data last year in our class, cool. And what they were looking at actually was more on the driver side of this idea of it's called extra long trips, especially if you're out of town and you don't really understand New York, the taxi driver will take you for a loop. And so they're able to identify from what kind of pickups and what areas and what kind of drivers would be the ones that would take people on extra long trips to pack their fare.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Forthcoming paper.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, and there was a lot of work with this data on identifying the drivers. Some people looked at it from that perspective to say, okay, you can actually identify where every driver lives, where they go, what their driving patterns are. So, and obviously there are privacy risks and dangers to having that sort of information as well. So yeah, I mean, so it's a really, and this is the thing, it's a really fascinating data set. There's a lot that you can learn, and you can really get a sense of kind of a lot of aspects of what it means to be in New York and how it works, and answer these sorts of questions that are very experiential. To put a data story behind that sort of thing is really cool. But it's all about figuring out how do you achieve that without getting stuff like this. The other example kind of looks more at the behavioral metadata, and just by looking at patterns in where there were, so the data scientist wanted to see, just as kind of an example, could he find out everyone who was frequenting a certain strip club in the city? So he looked at all of the pickups that left, middle of the night on a weekend night from right around some strip club in this, tip of Manhattan, and then looked at where the drop-offs were. And just from that information, you can see certain clusters. So each of these blue dots is a drop-off, and the yellow dots, if you can see them, are kind of the clusters of where there were many drop-offs. And so in one case, he found a cluster, looked up the address, found who the person was, found the person's social media, and could figure out he was going to other places, and where he worked, and that he had pictures online of strip clubs and stuff. And so he obviously didn't publish this because he was not trying to out anyone in particular. It's more about making the point that once you have this one data set, you can learn who's just people's behavior that they wouldn't realize anyone knows. Right? This sort of thing, you wouldn't realize that anyone's tracking this, that anyone could kind of be aware that you're, going to, whether it's a strip club or, just a particular restaurant or a park, it doesn't really matter, and then the fact, obviously, that this is released into the public is a whole different story. So you can kind of learn these very intimate patterns about individuals from government data that is, often released openly.
It's actually kind of even more problematic because OpenStreetMap has very specific node explanations for different clubs. So if a club is like LGBTQ and like known for it, it shows up in the data if you look at the granular one. So I mean that's the kind of thing that you don't want, like if you're not even out in terms of like your sexuality, etc. Like
yeah, no, that's a great example. That's not just about patterns of behavior or even kind of personal and sensitive ones. It can be ones that are very sensitive and even dangerous if people knew about it, or that you might be actively trying to keep secret. I know in Seattle there was a question of someone wanted a data set. They have some data set around some sort of community group that people would be affiliated with if they were maybe alcoholic or homosexual or different groups like that. And it was something that someone wanted to be released as open data, and obviously there were a lot of concerns about inadvertently outing people or exposing people for certain things they might not want to be exposed. So, and there's been a lot of conversations that we've had around groups trying to release police records that relate to sexual assault, and trying to do the best, manage that appropriately. And we've had some conversations with the Police Data Initiative and the Police Foundation and the National Network to End Domestic Violence, because the Police Data Initiative is, really working on opening up police data. There's a lot of concerns, for victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, because their privacy is really important, and if they're exposed, that can lead to a lot of harms and danger and chilling effects. So there are a lot of particular cases like that where it's really important. And actually, my next slide, one of the examples of kind of just other types of open data that have been released and caused trouble was that the Dallas police about exactly a year ago released a bunch of police records that had 6 names of people who had complained of sexual assault. And because the data set had not been properly scrubbed of those cases, they had removed the cases that were kind of classified as sexual assault, but not the cases that were, there were a couple of cases, these 6 that were, assault, and then in the notes or something, it said it was kind of more of an unconfirmed sexual assault or something like that. So it didn't show up in the obvious sense in the data, maybe their first pass scrub, but obviously if someone's looking at it, they can see, oh, this address or this person or someone in this neighborhood complained of sexual assault, which again, if the victims are not comfortable with that sort of approach, can have a lot of issues attached to it. So, some government data, if it's released, is not a huge deal, and some of the government data that might be released is incredibly sensitive. And so it's important to really understand what those risks are and the relative balance of those risks in any particular case. So as I've kind of alluded to, there's in some sense this trade-off between utility and privacy. There's a desire for the raw data sets and to release as much as possible. And that's also the data that's the most valuable. As you have every field and every level of granular detail, there's a lot more someone can do with it and learn from that data. But obviously, the more detail you have, the more information about a person gets out there, the easier it is to identify someone or attach it to other data sets. So cities kind of have to balance this trade-off between, how do you increase privacy to make sure you're not having risks that are too extreme without decreasing the utility to a point that the data set's not at all useful. And how do you, in any particular case, how much privacy is important versus how much utility is important, and what are the value, how much do you want to gain from accountability or collaboration or working together or transparency in one case versus how much privacy do you really have to protect in that data set. So there's a lot of complicated, this is kind of the, in some sense, the fundamental trade-off that we're working with here for a particular data set.
Yeah, so actually we had a quick debate about your graphic when we were looking through it.
Okay.
So where you guys landed on no data as the on the corner, and we were wondering, like, rather than thinking about maybe fake data or anonymized data under certain anonymity frameworks or aggregate data, so you're not giving out the individual data, but just aggregating. So why? I mean, we're just curious. Why did you guys end up at no data rather than some of these other alternatives?
Right. Yeah, I guess so. So this was more to lay out the total extremes. Okay. And you're right. Actually, probably be a more interesting chart to kind of the aggregate data, the anonymized data. That would be along this curve, right? So the idea is that the goal is to figure out where along this curve you want to be. But certainly the playbook is all about those in between places. I don't think the answer is often not going to be no data, but it's more just to kind of highlight the broad strokes. Yeah. And kind of just in terms of thinking about privacy and why it's important. Kind of in contrast to the previous slide, which is saying about how privacy and utility are kind of this trade-off in terms of individual data sets. That's not to say that privacy and kind of data and innovation are at odds in a broad level, right? Because these privacy risks exist and there's no way kind of around them, actually having an effective privacy program is really essential and actually enables more innovation in a lot of cases because these privacy risks are there and that trade-off around privacy and utility exists. So it's only by understanding those risks and being able to act upon them effectively that you'll be able to, that a city will be able to innovate and release the most amount of open data and kind of maximize what they can do with open data by really understanding those risks. Because if you don't, you're either going to not release data because there are risks to privacy that you don't want to infringe upon, but you don't know how to manage it. So you kind of withhold a lot of data that maybe could be released if you were thoughtful about it. Or you release too much data and then you release sensitive information, or there's a backlash, or you get yourself into trouble. So it's really by, so I think that actually it's very foundational and essential to have this sort of a privacy program with privacy standards and a deep understanding of these issues for cities. So before we get into the kind of the playbook itself, are there any questions or comments we want to add about kind of the open data and privacy and the landscape? Or I can jump into the playbook. Cool. So this came together I guess starting about a year and a half ago or a year and a quarter or so. So it actually started, so Gabe Cunningham is one of the co-authors, and he was an undergrad in LaTanya's class, and I forget which class it was, but they were, his final project, he was looking at data on open data about sexual assault and domestic violence, and he found that a number of cities were releasing data inappropriately. He found that while they were releasing these records, some of these crime records, and while they were removing the addresses themselves, they were leaving the geographic coordinates in the data set. And anyone with a computer can use coordinates to backtrack to an address. So he was like, wait, this is a huge issue. This is something that clearly, and this was probably in 2013 or something, so a couple years ago. just when a lot of cities were really starting. A couple cities were just starting at that point to do open data as a real thing. So that led to so in January of last year, at the Berkman Klein Center and at the law school, Susan Crawford organized a convening of chief data officers and innovation officers and some privacy experts to just kind of get into a room for a full day and talk about what are these issues, how have cities tried to adapt to them, what are the main issues that cities are grappling with, and just starting to get a sense of what does this landscape look like and what do we need to do about it and what can we do next to help make this, to help cities manage this better. Josh was one of the people in attendance there. And it was really great. Just, you had a broad range of cities in terms of their kind of knowledge and expertise about this sort of thing. I remember one of them at the end of, there was a presentation about that MIT metadata, credit card work. And afterwards, one of the CIOs was like, this is incredibly enlightening. Our thinking on this has been pretty primitive. And it was great to see, even just from that, from 2 hours in or an hour in, from sort of this educational, raising awareness around what open data and the privacy risks were, and to already see, people who work on open data in cities to kind of be responding to it and realizing this is something we really need to be thinking about. It's more complex than I realized. And so that was a great starting point. And after that, we kind of took what came out of that and helped develop this playbook really as a guide for city officials and how to manage best practices. So in terms of the playbook itself, it's meant very much as a tactical document. One of the things that we really tried to do as we were putting it together and thinking through like the stories and the best practices was to present the material in a way that was not academic, but actionable and something that a city official could read and have a better sense of what to do, or have a something they could implement, or they could look to a peer city and see what had done. So we very much tried to structure the document around that, which I think is interesting and just very different from your sort of typical academic report, which is really just about what's out there and what are some case studies and best practices, but really designed it around something that someone in the city who's already trying to release open data could use. So we have 4 kind of highest level recommendations, and each of those is supported by smaller, kind of sub recommendations and stuff like that. But so first is conducting risk-benefit analyses to inform the design of open data programs. That's really about just having a structured way to think through what are the risks and benefits of any particular case. Considering privacy at every stage of the data life cycle. When we talk about open data, it's very easy just to focus on the release of data and think about, well, we're releasing data now, suddenly we have to think about it. But so many of the privacy risks are borne out at the very beginning when data is collected, or as it's maintained, or even as data is, decisions are made of how long to keep data, whether it's online or to keep it internally, and when to delete that data from your records. Those are all really important decisions that have broad implications for privacy in cities. Our third recommendation is to develop, operational structures and processes to make sure that there's kind of a broad awareness throughout City Hall of privacy risks, and that there are actually processes in place to help cities manage privacy, as opposed to it having to be kind of an ad hoc process or just hoping that someone thinks about it. It needs to be, baked in and implemented to how cities manage data. And finally, we thought it was really important to emphasize public engagement and public priorities. That's something that had a really big impact on the success or failure of different open data and data collection efforts, especially around this, this sort of emerging gray area where our, personal relationships to data are, rapidly changing. The data that's collected by cities and released by cities is changing on a regular basis as they try to adapt to and develop and innovate with new technologies. And there isn't some sort of black and white line of, where sensitivity exists and does not exist. And so it's really important to, and from talking to CIOs, we've heard that, what might work in Chicago doesn't work in Seattle, right? Every city has its own priorities and relationships and communities and kind of priorities about what will matter or not. So it's really important, just given this area and the kind of the murky space that we're in, to figure out, build that relationship and make sure that, especially since the goal of open data is about, public trust and collaboration, and it's the individual, citizens' privacy, it's important to have those conversations and really be in dialogue with them, because that will help dictate what a city should do. Again, because there's no formal, technical, or legal basis for a lot of these data sets. Yeah.
Question, point one.
Yeah.
Can you really verbalize the benefits this early? Because mainly you oftentimes in open data just publish the data and think that some smart person may come along and really exploit this data. So I'm not sure if you really know the benefits, especially this early in the process. So for instance, the taxi data that you showed, why would New York City publish destination and point of start and stop points of taxi data? So the benefits are not really easy to verbalize. So can you just comment on that and see if we can actually give some examples of benefits that you can actually state early on?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, you're right that it's difficult. I think that you can still, even with the taxi trip data, you can anticipate some of the ways that people are going to use that data, right? And part of the reason to kind of put this sort of structure on it is not just to say, what are the benefits and how extreme are they, which is part of it, but also, to understand what are the aspects of the data that we think will enable those benefits, right? And so in terms of thinking through privacy and utility, and kind of part of the structure around the risk-benefit analyses is thinking through the elements of the data that create the risks or create the benefits, and to be able to do that in a way that says, okay, maybe this field that's creating a lot of privacy risk, we don't actually think that it actually will be that helpful in terms of most of the things that someone might do with it. So we feel pretty comfortable releasing it or removing it. Or, with the, say, obviously the time is a really interesting, the time of when a pickup occurred is really interesting. But, and could be, used for a lot of benefits and a lot of interesting analyses. But again, because there are privacy risks attached, it's, okay, well, if we think that there are benefits to this particular field, but also privacy risks, we can use that to inform how much we maybe generalize the data, or you're not going to want to remove that field entirely because there are clear benefits to it. So it's difficult to say, obviously, exactly what will happen, but I think for most data sets, you can have some intuition or some sense of how it might be used. And I think that also, with open data, one of the things that we're seeing is, in many cases, just releasing data sets kind of just to throw it out there is an approach that's been traditionally taken and is not so effective. I think it's really important for cities to kind of move to the next stage where they're really thinking about how might this data get used, and to engage with partners, whether it's academics or civic techs or students or whatever, about releasing data sets and having a clear sense of how that data will be used. To actually drive engagement towards the data, as opposed to just kind of thinking that some brilliant thing will happen with it. So I know you had a comment, but we can.
Yeah, I was actually sort of thinking of so actually extrapolating what you're proposing to further, do you guys imagine, especially in that first point, developing something similar to when it comes to construction and stuff in the US, generally you have to do this thing called the environmental impact assessment. And where there's actually a whole field of contractors and experts that only do environment impact assessments and provide these reports for cities and towns that are doing these assessments. But the criticism of those would be, well, it's expensive and it's slow, right? And so, it's I don't think necessarily that's necessarily exactly the direction you want to go to, where it's a really formalized assessment process. On the flip side, who do you see doing this analysis if it's not outside experts? Because I also find it a little hard to think that, if you're talking about you met with these CIOs and they're I didn't know anything like this was even possible, right? And now all of a sudden you're putting it their burden to be oh yeah, by the way, based off your 2-hour discussion section that you had, now you have to go think about risk-benefit analysis for every single data set you release, right? So it's is there enough expertise even within cities, or even within the community that they talk to, because the cities talk to a smaller community than all the experts that's out there, for them to be actually able to do something like the point that you're raising?
Yeah. No, those are both great questions. I think that we are seeing a move towards some sort of at least somewhat formalized process. So one of the things that we put together was, this is a part of a risk assessment that a city could work through to try and say, okay, here's a form and a structured way of saying, what are the benefits, what are the risks, what are the data fields that create those risks, and how much of an impact would that have, how likely is that to occur. So I think there is a move towards having some formalized structure. Probably doesn't need to be as extreme as the environmental but I think going through this process, something like this is really important for a lot of cases, just again to provide a way to it's not about trying to create a large burden, but about just providing a way to say, okay, these are the questions that need to be thought through and the way to balance them.
Right. And so what if they're wrong on their
Right.
assessment?
Right.
How do you see, so
Right.
what would happen then?
Right. I mean, so to go to your other question, I mean, that's a huge challenge that we're trying to work with is, how do you have someone who's to be doing this appropriately who doesn't have necessarily the expertise to do it? I think that longer term, there's a need, either you want to have, more people who do have this knowledge, kind of some cities have started hiring chief privacy officers, like Seattle just did one last year, which is great. So suddenly, now that's a city who has someone who's probably, has kind of the full contextual background understanding to do this. But most cities don't. One of the challenges that we found also was, there are already processes. Cities don't want more paperwork. They don't want more processes. When I was working with Boston to try to help them do something, trying to get them to add some questions about privacy to their questionnaire, it's really hard because they don't want to just add more questions. And so, you do get to this place of, what are the most fundamental 1 or 2 questions you should be asking, right? And it's really hard. And I think that, what we tried to do was get to something that could be, is kind of a very short term, something that can be hopefully, used as education and used in practice now or in the next couple of years. I think there's a lot of value in, what are longer term solutions around, having groups that do this sort of thing, that are more specially trained in actually thinking through these questions, because, or building in the more thorough practices that's not just 1 or 2 quick questions just to get someone to think about this, but to go through a more thorough process. And some cities are starting to adapt that or adopt that, and doing much more heavy lifting on some of the more sensitive and hard to think through data sets, whereas others might just have, it might just be something where they just hope that they remember, they'll think about it or they have 1 or 2 questions. So it's really hard to, get cities to actually, adopt any of the best practices in something like this, because it is very hard and their backgrounds typically don't give them the knowledge, the sort of data science, just intuition, even for a sense of, that someone who's, a computer scientist or data scientist who's thought, worked on this done some reading on it, might look at a data set and have a pretty good sense of, someone can map all of these out, someone can piece these together in these ways, but that expertise just isn't in a lot of cities. So it's a really big challenge, and I think what we tried to do is say, okay, given the current state of play in a lot of cities, what can you do? And then kind of what can you start to do to build for the next couple of years? But it's a real challenge, and I think, if a city's wrong, there's not a ton. And the goal, we try to do is provide a lot of, some of the stuff I talked through earlier around the limits of de-identification and those risks, we try to talk through and help provide some of that context for cities of, what are the different types of ways that data can be re-identified and how does that happen and what's an example of that happening, some of the stuff I've already talked through, to provide some of that context. Yeah.
I think in some ways, expertise in a city is less of an issue than sort of the organizational structure of these programs. So for example, San Francisco has yeah, right. Next slide. Sorry, I jumped the gun.
No, go for it.
San Francisco's adapted the tool on the previous slide into a a tactical tool for assessing risks and benefits for each data set, and that kind of it helps guide cities through these issues without needing data scientists to come in and do the measurement. What I see as the issue, though, is San Francisco has a few different staff in their program, so they can have one person in charge of gathering up as many potential open data sets as possible, and then another person filtering out the ones that are the problem. But in smaller cities, like in ours, we just have one person doing all that stuff.
All right, is that you?
Yeah. Right, exactly. So I'm in charge of, in cities we love performance metrics, and so like I'm assessed based on how many data sets I push out.
Right.
And also on how few bad things happen when I do push them out, and those are kind of conflicting metrics. And so what you really need is this sort of adversarial system where you have one person in charge of pushing out a volume of data and another person in charge of mitigating risk. And so I think that the next kind of evolution in open data privacy is going to be cities kind of seeing that they need to add more people to these programs too.
Well, so I'm actually really curious then, like, for you guys to think. I mean, if you think about like going forward, like, do you see that direction with like the environmental impact assessments as like the model to go towards in terms of? I mean, that is more of an adversarial system where you have City Hall and the like in Boston you would have like the Boston Redevelopment Authority. They're the ones out. They want construction. They want like new builds. But then there is another arm to the city that thinks about the environmental impact and local impacts, and they do these assessments, or they hire contractors to do these assessments for them to evaluate, well, this proposal that you've brought to us, whether it makes sense or not.
And for us, for probably 80% of new data sets, I do most of this. I do the full life cycle mostly myself with a few kind of checks and balances from other folks. But for the 20% of data sets that I recognize as highly sensitive, then we pull in a much larger, more bureaucratic group to do the sort of system you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't know if I would, again, say that it's like an adversarial approach, because I think that the interests are more aligned in this case. It's not, the people who, sorry, the open data managers and other folks are also, could be the same people who are trying to do this or are very conscious of these types of issues. So it's, but I think there's a move in certain cities to bake more of a process in, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but, having more people who are, tasked with doing this, or even just making this a clear part of a job description for someone. And it's hard because a lot of cities, they just have one person who's doing everything. But the cities who have the most experience and have been doing this for longest, like the San Franciscos or Chicago's and Seattle's, they've been able to bring more people in. And it's not just about open data. There's obviously privacy in all sorts of other data collection efforts and stuff that cities are doing. So, but open data is a key part. So I think part of it is to say, yes, cities should be building more capacity so that they can actually work through a form like this one or the one on the previous slide, but then also to have these sorts of guides to say, okay, if you're trying to adapt something, at least here's a starting point. And if you don't want to, you can see maybe a more thorough version and then adapt one or two questions for yourself. Okay. So it's really just about putting something on the table, yeah.
As you pointed out earlier, the vulnerability or the risk really surfaces when you do combinations. So in this framework that you have, these open data framework that you have, do you actually at any point ask any questions in terms, because when you put out a data set and it's the first data set, maybe there's very little risk,
right?
Okay, or very easily identifiable risk. But if you sort of put it out having already a set of other data sets, then there are potential ways of combining the data that will actually surface a vulnerability or a risk.
Yeah.
Do you at any point in this playbook, your framework here, do you actually look at the data when you actually ask questions about the risk of publishing this particular data? Do you show the background, the context in terms of the other data sets that are already there? Do you sort of ask questions in terms of expecting risks that come into play, not standalone, but in combination?
Yeah, and I think I don't know if it's it's probably not on it's not on this slide, I think, but, we have kind of in addition to the sort of like risk benefit impact assessment form. We have more of like a questionnaire for cities when they're releasing data. This is just a sample of it. Questions around individual identifiers and locations and coordinates and kind of highlighting some of the key things. I'm not sure, I forget if in here there's a question about other data sets, but we definitely talk about it as we're kind of going through the risks that occur of how you have to think through the other data sets that are out there. That's actually a question that, it's tough because of all the questions that you can ask, someone as they're doing an impact assessment of a data set. That's the one that is almost hardest to ask that I think is like the hardest for, your average kind of open data manager to answer. Because a lot of these that are specific to a single data set, at least like, okay, does this have geographic coordinates in it? Yes or no, right? Does this have unstructured text, right? Yes or no? Or, does it have some sort of individual identifier that links people between records or that links different records to each other, right? So those questions I think are really important. We talk about that a lot, but it's harder, as we're trying to be somewhat limited in what we do. That's kind of the question that I think often is going to fall by the wayside, just because that opens up, an entire other, suddenly it's a lot harder for someone to answer that question without doing more of like a whole research like more of a larger analysis than something that's specific to the data set. Again, so it's kind of the tension between like thoroughness and what is someone actually going to do. But I agree that that's obviously an important.
And I just think it's important to know you can never answer that question completely because it's not confined to the open data portal itself.
Right.
You could pull in census data or other data from outside the city's open data portal. So
maybe more useful to actually come in terms of an active saying what a municipality should do. Having experts actually study the area rather than going into the municipality and asking these questions, coming out with some already baked plans in terms of how they should go about doing open data, and really not, because pretty much they all have the same types of data. Okay, they all have the ones that you showed on your foot. Coming out with something as a sort of master plan, this is what you should do, rather than assessing what they would like to do or thinking of doing. That's a different approach.
Yeah, I think we see that as kind of the next step of this type of work, really, is to get to that sort of much more of a technical guidelines. A lot of cities want not just, okay, here are my options, and I can generalize the data, I can remove this field, I can make an address to a zip code or something. They're kind of like, okay, but like for this data set, what is actually the best practice? The hardest question is, what is actually the best way to release this data set, right? Like, if I'm doing taxi trips, like what do I actually need to do, right? That's
valid for all municipalities. It's the same stuff. It's just doing the exercise,
right?
5-10 times, doing it right, and then basically spreading the word out to it.
Well, so I can jump in. I really do think it depends on the municipality, because even though the fields are the same, the uniqueness of the people within a municipality will depend on the characteristic and the demographic of the population. So for example, when Professor Sweeney did the Weld experiment, she focused on the Cambridge voter list, and she was able to talk about the uniqueness of a particular person with a particular birthday in the zip code and how many people with those characteristics were in her data set. She found 2 that matched Weld's profile of just zip code, birthday, and one other thing that I don't remember. So it really does depend. Like, you can have a big municipality and a really homogeneous population, then you have a little more anonymity built in to the demographic of the population. But let's say you have very unique qualities within a population. In a zip code, you have like 10 Black people. Like, you will know exactly who those people are, and if you have a standardized, like, this is what you should do and this is a cookie cutter way of doing it, it doesn't really mitigate all of the risks that might be associated, like it's said in the examples over there. Just a caveat.
Yeah, I think that there are risks like that in terms of even population density, right? What works in downtown Boston is not going to work in Cambridge, is not going to work in Dorchester, right? So there are those sorts of things that you can somewhat that can somewhat be based on the technical. You can have a quantitative basis for that, but then there's even the points around kind of just the public engagement and priorities and stuff where, one city might want it to be more anonymized in a different way. So I think there's a lot of room for progress around kind of saying, like, even just a case study of one city and doing an analysis of, okay, if we do it a zip code, what does that do versus going to a block group? What does that do versus going to a neighborhood? I mean, doing that sort of more experimental or theoretic, getting some sort of quantitative and technical basis for it. But, I think it's also, so there's a lot of room for that. I think that's a very hard technical question to go through and do that. But I think there's a lot of value, even with the best practice out there, in city government, getting it actually implemented and having a process that takes advantage of those best practices is also really important. So so I think so we're kind of skipped ahead. So yeah, I'll talk about the second one, about data lifecycle, and a couple stories that I think are interesting here. So in terms of one of the recommendations, be mindful of privacy before collecting data. There's a lot of as with, there's open data and there's public records and there's leaks, and so once a lot of the privacy risks are kind of created once data is collected, and so data minimization around limiting what data is actually collected can be a really valuable approach to protecting privacy. So one example of this is the Array of Things in Chicago. So that's a new kind of sensor network that Chicago has been building up over the last couple of years that's just really being deployed now. One of the data sets that they are interested in is pedestrian counts and vehicle counts. And to get that information, the sensors need to take video of the streets or pictures of the streets. And what they do, though, is because all they want are the pedestrian counts, they do that, they have an algorithm that runs to calculate the pedestrian counts on the sensor itself so that those images and pictures never get sent to the cloud or stored in any internal server. And so that's a really great example, because obviously if you were to have all of these sensors taking videos for, even taking a picture, even if it's just once an hour a day, you have a lot of information that's in there, and that's opens up very large privacy risks of having pictures, which can then be used to, do facial recognition or license plate reading, or just to have, kind of a surveillance camera on every street corner. But by being thoughtful about what data they actually wanted, they could be, thoughtful about limiting their data collection in a really valuable way. And so again, it's kind of, having a thought in terms of the benefits and saying, okay, the benefits, what we wanted the pedestrian count so that we can, analyze how people are moving throughout the city and stuff like that. To know what you want out of the data is valuable to then say, okay, well, we can limit collecting everything else because we know what we want to get out of it. And let's, we can get that information without storing all the pictures for everyone to see or forever. Yeah. Do you have a comment or not? So I think that's a great example of how cities can adopt this sort of practice. Talked about some of the questionnaire for releasing data. It's another thing for cities to think about is retiring data from online open data portals or deleting data that they have internally rather than just storing data forever. There's kind of a sense of, more data is better. Why would we ever delete anything? Storage is so cheap. But, there's a lot of, as data sets grow, there's a lot more information that can be revealed about individuals. So one really interesting example here was the license plate readers of the Seattle Police Department. So that's, a cop car has a license plate reader where every time, just taking pictures and video and scans all the license plates to see if they've, if there's a warrant against the owner or if it's registered as a stolen vehicle or something like that, right? But what happened was they were actually storing all of these records of where the license plate and when it was, where it was, and when it was seen. And over 3 years, they'd collected over 7 million records of license plates, and none of these had been deleted, and all of this was public record that the ACLU got through a public records request. So, anyone could have gotten this information. They didn't release it as open data, but it was publicly accessible as a data set. So out of these, 7 million records, barely any of them had a, positive hit in terms of it was a stolen vehicle or something like that, which means that, there are about 7 million records of where and when people were just driving around the city and being, there was no reason for the police to be collecting any data about them. So this is an example where, there's obviously value in having a license plate reader that can say, oh, here's a stolen vehicle, but does that data need to be stored, right? Or does it need to be stored for more than a month? Those sorts of things. Maybe you think, okay, well, we want to keep it a little bit because maybe our car will show up as stolen, but after, say, a month or whatever, 90 days, I think is now what their policy is, you don't need to keep all of this data. So it's important for cities to be thoughtful kind of throughout the life cycle and to again, think through why are we collecting this data? What would we do with it? Why should we store it? And if the value is kind of a real-time, search for stolen cars or, over a 90-day period, you don't need to store that for 3 years, which suddenly after 3 years is a lot of information. You can start tracking people's individual patterns. The ACLU was able to track the police cars patterns and figure out like where their shifts started and stopped and where they would break for lunch and all sorts of stuff from the police cars, from figuring out where they were. But so it was, after this happened though, Seattle actually developed a policy of, I think, 90-day retention for this. So, some of these cases where, there's kind of a negative case study is something where, often something good will come out of it because it'll kind of raise awareness and help cities realize that they need to be more thoughtful and adopt better practices. So, okay, so it goes till 12, right? Okay, cool. So I'll quickly, let's see. So one interesting story here is around, so we've talked a lot about kind of increasing internal process and stuff like this, and you don't have to actually read through the map, but this is the city of Boston's map for kind of what the process is for releasing an open data set and where they do security and privacy reviews. But one really interesting story from Boston around this is that we had identified about 6 months or a year ago that the 311 data set had comments in them, right? So this sort of unstructured text is a really big risk for open data because people can kind of put anything in it. They can put names, they can put phone numbers, personal information. So there's, a lot of reasons not, that's a type of data that's really risky to release, and we had identified that and started going through a process to remove that field from Boston's 311 data set. And about 3 weeks ago, someone emailed the city saying, hey, I just found a couple people's names and phone numbers in these comments. That's obviously a huge privacy risk. And luckily, because the city had started this process, had already recognized that and started a process to remove that field, they actually were planning to remove that field, 2 days later. So it was already in progress. And so by having, been thoughtful about this and prepared and had a process and, already in the way towards removing the data, when this came in, instead of being a sort of, you can imagine in a city it being something that, they spend the whole day trying to figure it out and building out a process, wait, how do we change how we get this data and, change scripts in terms of pulling the data and storing it and all of that. They actually were already ready to do that. They just had to flip a switch. So it's a great example of how preparation and having effective privacy programs, again, is enabling the city to release this data and kind of have effective open data programs rather than, release too much data and then have a controversy come up and let it turn into a real controversy or, kind of have to scramble for multiple days to put out the fire. So I think that's a really interesting story that just happened around this. Public records laws are a really big risk here, kind of just because, again, they're a way to get, for the public to get data, and they're pretty expansive. There are very limited exceptions for privacy in public records laws. And so this is, again, why it's really important to think about privacy at the point of collection, because a lot of data that you wouldn't release publicly as open data can be released through public records, and the laws around privacy are, again, kind of operating in this very old model. So something like the taxi trips in New York, that was released through public records requests. The license plate readers in Seattle was released through public records requests. So this is data that is very sensitive, can reveal a lot of individual patterns, but anyone can get it if they want. So it's something that one reason for cities to be really thoughtful what data they actually collect and store, because once you have data, it's pretty easy for that to get out. Let's see, I'll skip that. I think public engagement, as I mentioned at the beginning, is really important here. One great example of kind of, and it's important for cities to be transparent as they're, if they're trying to be transparent about releasing data. It's important to be transparent about the process of releasing that data. You don't want to be, releasing data that is sensitive and then kind of decreases the trust and, deletes the whole purpose of the program itself, or you don't want people to feel like you're not being responsive in a program that's about being transparent and responsive. So, and again, because there are these really sensitive issues around privacy, the public is going to be very conscious of these issues, and when they see a data set, they want to feel that they're being respected and that the city is acting as kind of effective data stewards. So in Chicago, they released taxi trip data. Taxi trips is one of the ones the cities really grapple with, so it comes up a lot, I guess. They released taxi trips like in December, and they had done a lot of really great work thinking through, how to prepare that data set to minimize the privacy risks. But they also released a blog post explaining what they had done, which was really great. So they were not just, a lot of cities might add random noise or generalized data or prepare it in some way to try and protect privacy, but they don't actually share that, which creates problems really in two ways. One being that this, people might not realize that something's been done, so they are, thinking that their privacy hasn't been taken into consideration, but maybe it has. But also, it can enable people to kind of not understand the data without proper context, or even make false inferences. A lot of cities will add randomness to, coordinates without telling people that there's been randomness added. So you might think that, a crime that, there might be a crime report on one house that happened down the block, but if you don't know that there's randomness, you'll attribute it to that house, right? So this sort of adding context and telling the story is really important. So Chicago did a great job of that, which was great. And again, and here's another story from Seattle about building support for new programs and why it's so important to have positive and proactive public engagement around data collection and data releases. Seattle they put out a new sort of mesh network set of devices throughout downtown that was supposed to help police communicate in case of emergencies. And they hadn't had any public process about this. They put these sensors out, and someone noticed it and started, they published a profile saying, the city's tracking all of our movements, they're trying to spy on us, all of that, right? And there was a huge backlash, and the city kind of came back and said, actually, that's not what we're doing. And the city didn't really have a clear policy around it. They weren't that responsive, but they eventually came back saying, the technology that we have doesn't even enable us to do what you think that we're doing. But it was kind of too late, right? The public had already kind of turned this into the city is spying on us. They're putting out sensors. They want to track all of our movements. And, even though that's actually in this case not what was going on, the city wasn't able to counteract that narrative, and they had to shut down the program. And so, being kind of building out this public support beforehand and making sure people know about it is really important. Again, it might seem like increasing the process of, turning the new technology on, but it's actually going to make it much more effective once you do and enable you to use this new technology if the public feels like they are engaged and buy into what you're trying to do. And with the array of things, Chicago has done a lot of work being really transparent and having really thorough deliberations around open comments on privacy policies and stuff like that to get people to buy in, so that when they do start, tracking, doing data collection, everyone's comfortable with what data is being collected and what's going to happen with it. And so it can be a much more kind of positive civic program. Obviously a lot of what we talked about goes beyond open data and touches on smart cities more broadly, as there's new data collection efforts and new sensors put in place. And so, it's important for cities to understand these privacy risks, not just as they're releasing data, but also as they're, developing and implementing new technologies. I think Link NYC is a really great example of this. Their privacy policy is kind of a fun read. It's actually pretty short and interesting if you are like a privacy advocate, because what they do is, obviously the sensors that these kiosks are tracking, your phone when you connect, and they can get the obvious information such as like, kind of like the name of the phone and kind of who you are, but they also can track, where you are in your browsing patterns and stuff like that. And what Link NYC does is that they very quickly early on categorize, PII in a very traditional way, like your name, maybe your MAC, I don't even know if MAC address is in there, but kind of like the one or two very obvious things like your name and email address when you sign up for the online service. But everything else, your browsing history, your locations is, sensitive aggregate anonymous information, right? They kind of they separate these things out and say, okay, well, we're not going to do anything with PII. The PII, we respect PII, we understand that, and everything else, we're free to sell it to people. And it's kind of in that first place where they make these definitions where it's really critical to have an understanding of, what are the privacy risks of data that's been collected, like what are the sensitive fields and the not sensitive fields, and how can people use this data is really important, because to make informed decisions so that, when a city's putting out new sensors, they don't just sell or share everyone's browsing histories and locations, which is really sensitive data, but actually understand that that should also be part of the PII. So it's an example of kind of why, for the sort of smart cities and new technology and sensors, this is also a really important factor. And one of the, here's kind of a couple of the things that are more directly applied to smart cities from the playbook. The fourth one is not in there, but is really critical about, building in privacy with partnerships with private companies that are actually doing these technologies. Obviously, Link NYC is an example of where that hasn't happened, but, it's cities, most of what cities do with, they're not going to be developing their own sensors in almost every case. They're going to be working with a company. And so they're kind of, their privacy policies in practice or the way that they're, affecting individual privacy is based on how that vendor respects privacy, right? And so it's important at the process of actually creating contracts and selecting vendors to view privacy as an essential component of an agreement, not just, what can your technology do and what data are you collecting, but how are you respecting privacy? Otherwise, cities can be, right now, cities are often handcuffed by their existing vendors and existing contracts, because you can't, if you have a public Wi-Fi program and suddenly you realize that you should be more respectful of privacy, but your vendor has their own privacy policy, you can't really change that now. But the next time you do, you can make sure you select a public Wi-Fi provider that is going to be more respectful of browsing history and all of that stuff. So, but it's important to start building that in as an essential component of bidding and contracting and all of that. Yeah, I mean, I think, I've talked a little bit about some of the other questions that need to be asked and addressed with this type of work. I think one of them, obviously, there's the technical guidelines. There's kind of, again, a question of how do you actually get cities to implement this? What are the best ways, whether it's on a research side or, policy group side or on the city, what are the best ways to actually get this sort of thinking and this awareness into the practice of collecting data and releasing data and doing that sort of innovation. And then, I think cities and researchers need to think a lot more broadly, just generally around, how should cities balance privacy and providing services? What are their kind of fundamental responsibilities to protect privacy how does that conflict or how is that complementary with their responsibility to protect citizens and provide services? These are kind of pretty big philosophical questions about government, and at what point should those should you fall on one end or another of a spectrum, or where should you say, okay, I want public Wi-Fi, and so I'm willing to give up privacy, or I'm not, and how do you make those decisions? I think are really broad questions that cities are just trying to think about. So. Yeah, thanks. If there's any other questions, you got a couple more minutes.
Anyone? I have a quick question for you, because we also have somebody visiting us from Greece. My understanding of your work and like the work of the group has been mostly American-centered, right?
Yeah.
So have you guys talked internationally or other countries where is there differences that if you have that you have heard about issues that are faced overseas versus in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean that's honestly I would say a blind spot of my work that I really haven't focused on that perspective, especially around open data. So I'm not sure. I'm curious if you have other thoughts on how you would approach this stuff differently, or.
I would just basically, the cultural issue is very important. For instance, I mentioned to my students that you open up a local newspaper like the Beacon Hill Times, and you actually can see transactions, real estate sales transactions by name, by address, and the price.
Yes.
That is a shocking piece of information. When I say that in class, they don't believe me. So I basically decided this time that I'm actually take a piece of the Beacon Hill Times and show
bring
it
some
to them.
newspapers back.
So that basically is a public record information in Greece as well. But as you pointed out very nicely in the second transparency there, they're basically, nobody will go and get that data because it's very hard, it's not easily accessible. So it's there and it's a public record available in Greece as well. But seeing it in a local newspaper would be something that, if that were to happen in Greece, people would actually start complaining very vigorously. Okay, so the cultural issue is very important, and basically that's a big problem as well, because having such a culture in places is very difficult to get open data out there. So you need some quick wins, something that's very non-invasive, something that'll just show its benefit very quickly and make them feel comfortable before you do other things. So I think the issue is a very good point. And,
so what are you guys looking at for a quick win right now?
Transit data. Okay, but then again, you have the bus company, which is run by the city, which doesn't want to show how well they're performing or not performing. So it's so you want to find something that the benefits not only to the citizens, but also to the public sector. I mean, so the benefits are, there are benefits very well defined for the citizen, but then they have to be benefits for the public organization as well, so that you can have them on board.
I'm actually curious on the transit data, because I've been reading in Germany where they don't want to release the transit data, not necessarily because of the performance issue, but they think they could sell it. Like that German cities aren't like think it's a product that the city has, and then they could actually monetize it. Versus like in the U.S., we sort of mostly taking the approach that this is free things that should be offered to the public for people to build on. And I don't know if that's an issue that you have encountered.
No,
there's an interesting debate going on now about whether or not cities should try to monetize access to open data, and how to do that. I don't really understand it from either like philosophical or legal perspective, right? I mean, I think that there's a lot of we did some work in Boston around licensing open data, and pretty much saw that the city has really no copyright to its data. Like, we don't even feel confident that we could release the data, requiring like CC BY requiring attribution, right? So we released it totally public domain. So legally, I'm not sure, what you can do around actually saying you have to pay for access to this data. You can have tiers, and maybe in terms of access to like, higher rates of quality or
value added.
Yeah, other types of value add, but it kind of seems that that's not the point of open data. I mean, I realize cities are trying to be creative around funding and paying for this type of stuff, but how does that then play with the service of open data? And the whole point is to be totally open for anyone to use it in any way. And so I don't think we'll see much of cities trying to do that. I know some are trying to think through that, and I'm sure there are arguments that I'm not fully aware of that are more supportive of it, but I don't really see the
so in your view, you view open data still like the way it's currently been of it. It's a public service. The city's taxpayers are just like, they get a benefit out of it, so they should pay for it. There shouldn't be like a business model that's built more on top of that.
Yeah, I'm just not sure. I mean, I think open data programs can do a lot of work to be better and to create more impact. And I think that's really important. There's a lot of room there. I just don't know if I see it as a place where there's kind of a money, like a financial or business case to it. And I don't know what that would be. I mean, I'd be curious to see a city or two try it and just, see how it works and see what the reaction is. But yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Oh, sorry.
Last comment.
Sorry. Is there work being done to develop rapid response kind of tactics when there are problems? And what's this? What I'm always thinking about is this idea that like data lives forever, and so like when a company releases a bad batch of food, they recall the food, but you can't recall the data. So what happens when there's a privacy violation?
I mean, I think it's a real question. I think, again, it's important for cities to realize that when you release open data, you can never truly remove it, right? So even if you remove it from the portal, I mean, it's still somewhere out there, probably, whether it's on Wayback Machine or someone's downloaded it. So, again, I think that's why it's important to be careful up front, before you're releasing data, rather than, you can't just take a kind of a wait and see approach, because once it's out there, it's out there. But I don't know if there are really more effective ways to like purge a really bad data set that shouldn't be out there.
Well, minimum, you could, I mean, like, so I'm actually curious for the Dataverse team, if you're familiar with Dataverse.
A little bit, yeah.
What you guys do when you guys take down data, and like, what is the approach that Dataverse takes?
It's actually a big conversation that we have right now. But what we do is we basically accession it right away. And it's an option where we have like different versions of the data, and then you pick, separate versions to the accession.
Data tags.
But then, do you guys notify users who've already downloaded the
No,
data?
so that's actually come up like within the past couple of weeks. We were like, should there in our notification, and we're looking at our messaging and notification when people want to deaccession data or restrict data that has been public in the past. Like, should there be something saying, like, the cat's already out of the bag? Like, it's possible that someone already has this data, something that.
And sometimes, so in the cities, right, and obviously you can remove it, but that someone's probably downloaded it. And I feel like there's also a tension between do you want to raise more awareness to the privacy risk, right? Because it might be that, the risk, you don't want to necessarily call attention to the fact that this can happen. So, I don't know what the right answer is there, but for some of that stuff, it's not necessarily worth it to notify everyone. I'm not sure, depending on what the risk is.
Because my mental model I was thinking would be like similar to the way Twitter handles deleted tweets.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously if you get the Firehose from Twitter, you can just archive your own tweets if you want it, if you're paying for the Firehose. But their terms of use for if a tweet gets deleted is they push it out again with the deleted tag.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to keep maintaining the Firehose, like access to the Firehose, you're supposed to then delete your personal copy of it. And so there, because they have like terms of use in certain ways of enforcement, essentially it's like if they find out that you are actually archiving the deleted tweets, they can cut off your access.
Right. So yeah, so we don't really have that legal basis. But again, you can tell people you should delete this data set, but it's hard to enforce that if it's just on their own person. That's kind of the challenge of the sort of like download, like the release and download model of open data is that there is no protection against that. It's not a sort of like closed system where someone goes in and accesses the data and never gets to download it. So I don't know how you can, so I think that's the challenge.
I think sometimes what cities do, and I know that the federal government does this, is they implement the subscription model so that they can do this particular incentive structure, right? Because you get access to our ongoing data, then you need to make the revisions if we put out corrections to the data. Obviously that has no teeth, but it's like one kind of model that they do.
Or like data use agreements. Right?
Yeah, that's more like a barrier to entry. Like, you should know that, what you're doing, if you misuse it, this will happen. But if you're an adversarial, like,
no, I totally agree. But like, this more like legitimate actors that want to do the right thing. Like, if you're making them sign a data use agreement, you can also incorporate if this data gets taken down.
Yeah, so I skipped that slide, but we do talk about data use agreements and how I think that there are a lot of cases where open data, you want to share the data, but open data is just not the right strategy, and you're better off for really sensitive stuff, working with a policy group or a researcher and saying, here's a data use agreement that really clearly specifies what you can and can't do in terms of re-identifying or releasing the data or anything, and you can still get through. So there are a lot of those sorts of like in between closed and open that I think are valuable. So, and where data use agreements can have a lot of impact.
So in terms of future work, what are you planning on doing with it? What are the next steps?
So there's no exact actual next step in terms of the particular open data project. I've been doing a lot of work with the city of Boston on their open data portal. They just released a new program like 2 weeks ago. So helping them think through privacy and engagement and stuff like that. But continuing to broadening beyond I'm kind of broadening beyond open data, and I think more generally about how cities should be using technology and stuff like that. So
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. It's a lot of fun.
And thank you for coming as well.